by the time I got to my 12th grade year.
All right, we were talking about last time about imperialism. We were talking about how there was this race for empire among all the great powers. And there was this race for empire that impacted World War I in the sense that as Great Britain became increasingly concerned with the expansion of Germany's overseas empire and Germany's naval fleet, that was a major reason why Great Britain decided that it was in its best interest to make an alliance with its age-old enemy France and Russia against Germany. So that the triple entente came together, France, Great Britain, and Russia, because Great Britain decided that Germany was its greatest threat. So we're going to talk about imperialism today and how you had these different imperial powers competing for territory in Africa and also in Asia, as we'll see today. And then also we're going to talk about the last piece of the puzzle, how a number of international developments in the beginning around 1905, you had a series of international crises that finally culminated in the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and the outbreak of the war in August of 1914, 100 years ago. So we're gonna get to that today as well. So let's first talk about imperialist competition. And we're talking about how there's a lot of imperialist competition in Africa, and how Great Britain became increasingly angry at Germany because they saw Germany as a threat. Now, last time we talked about how in 1896, Great Britain invaded the Boer Republic of Transvaal in an effort to incorporate this territory into their possessions in South Africa. And the forces of Transvaal, led by President Paul Kruger, crushed the British, defeated them. It was a big David versus Goliath type battle, and the Boers won. And what really angered the British was, well, they were humiliated, of course, but they were also angry that the German Emperor, Kaiser William II, sent a note of congratulations to Paul Kruger. For William II, any victory of Germans, he considered the Boers to be Germans. They were descended from German colonists and Dutch colonists. He considered it to be a victory for a German nationality or German nationalism. Well, Britain could not allow this defeat to go unanswered, so they were determined to take action against the Boer republics. And but they wanted to make sure that Germany did not get involved. So they signed an agreement with Germany called, and it wasn't really a formal treaty, but they just made an understanding that they would hand over the land of Namibia. Now it was called German Southwest Africa. Now it's the nation of Namibia. This land was basically handed over to the Germans as part of this kind of way of buying them off to try to get them out of the situation. It's kind of sad, though. This is something I just learned about recently. The Germans, after they acquired control of Namibia or Southwest Africa, when they controlled this territory, they determined that the area, since it had a rather temperate climate, Southwest Africa, this particular part of Africa has a climate akin to, let's say, California. It's, mild winters, hot summers. It's not jungle. So the Germans decided that the land could support a European population. So the Germans decided to create a greater Germany in Namibia by bringing in colonists. But they found that the people who lived there didn't appreciate that too much. So they actually fought a war of genocide. They actually decided that they needed just to kill all the people who lived there. So they systematically killed thousands of Africans. And so this war in Namibia is often pointed out as an example of how Adolf Hitler's genocidal views, where it's okay to kill a whole race of people if they get in your way, were not just a Nazi phenomenon. The Germans at the turn of the 20th century were saying, oh, we're going to create greater Germany, we're just going to kill all these black people, all these Africans, because they're a subhuman race. So but it was thousands upon thousands of people were massacred by the Germans. And needless to say, they never achieved creating Greater Germany. Only a few thousand Germans actually settled there. And of course, after World War I, the land was taken from them anyway. So, taken from the Germans anyway. Now, with Namibia out of the way and the Germans happy, the British could concentrate their efforts on defeating the Boer republics. So that's where you get the Boer War that was fought for 3 years. Now, this Boer War was very much an embarrassment to the British because, you see, in this war, the Boers decided to fight it like a guerrilla war. And instead of meeting the British, who had much larger military forces, in an open battle, they kind of did the same thing that the Americans had done in the American Revolutionary War, in the sense that during the campaigns in South Carolina, they basically fought a hit-and-run campaign where they would make quick shots on the British and shoot them and then run away. And so they just wanted to wear out the British. They didn't want to meet the British in a major battle because they knew that they would lose in a major confrontation. But with these hit-and-run attacks, they hoped to just wear out the British, so eventually the British would just give up and withdraw. But it was a very bloody war. And eventually the British did the same thing that the Americans had done and were doing in the Philippines, in which the Spanish had done in Cuba, creating concentration camps where you force thousands of people off their homes and bring them into camps where you can keep your eyes on them. So that way the civilian population can't support the military population. So thousands of Boer women and children were brought into these concentration camps where a lot of them died of disease and starvation. And then there were all kinds of atrocities committed by both sides. The Boers would murder the British soldiers and kill them, after they captured them, and then the British would return the favor and massacre Boers. And so it was a very bloody, terrible war. Now, the thing about this war was that this was not a war against people of a different color. They weren't black, they weren't Asian, these were white people. So when these scenes of these wars were reported in the international press in New York City, in London, in Germany, in France, I mean, Europeans could sympathize with Boers because they were similar to them. They had the same color skin, same color hair, and so Europeans were shocked and just disgusted by the British and their conduct of this war. And so it was a real black eye to the British, and the British were very embarrassed by the whole affair. It's not one of the high points of the British Empire's history. It's considered one of their dark chapters. So a lot of ways, the way that a lot of Americans might view the Vietnam War, Britons came to view the Boer War in the same light as a war that was they won the war, but it was, in a sense, but it was an embarrassment to them because of all the atrocities that took place. If you ever want to see a great movie that's based on real events of the Boer War, you should see a movie called Breaker Morant. You can see it on Netflix. Great movie. It really captures the whole spirit of the Boer War, what was going on during this conflict. But anyway,
what was it?
Breaker Morant.
Breaker Morant?
Yeah, it came out in the 1980s. I think it's on Netflix. But anyway, now eventually the British did win the war, but they also won the war by basically making concessions. The war came to an end, and the British decided basically to give the Boers largely autonomy and independence. And eventually the Boer republics were incorporated into the new Union of South Africa in 1910. Now, the problem with this system was that in granting the Boers autonomy and independence, when they created the Union of South Africa in 1910, the Boer population, even though they were a minority within the whole area, they had a large amount of they had greater political representation. So even though they were a minority, under the system of government was set up, they had a greater voice in the political system than anybody else. And that's why after World War II, eventually South Africa instituted this system, this apartheid system that separated the races, that separated the whites from the blacks, from the mixed races, and every race, basically, if you were not white, you were a second-class citizen. And that system of apartheid that was set up after World War II was only dismantled in the 1990s with the rise of the African National Congress Party in South Africa. So these events that happened in the Boer War over 100 years ago, had a big, long-time influence on the history of South Africa, all the way up until the dawn of the 21st century. All right, so you can see the British were just, the Boer War was a big embarrassment for the British, and a lot of British people blamed the Germans for all this. They believed that the Germans had been the ones kind of encouraging and supporting the Boers, and so the Boer War made the British mad, but it also made them angry toward Germany, created anti-German feeling within the British Empire among great people of Great Britain. Now, there was also a big race for Asia. Africa was not only it was just one area of the contest. Another area where great powers competed was Asia, and especially East Asia. If I can get this map. All right, that's not what I want. Okay. Now, if you look at a map of Asia, if you look at a map of Asia, a couple powers to keep into place. Great Britain controlled India. Here's Great Britain. Here's Russia. Russia was expanding from west to east, so they controlled a big block of Eurasia. Southeast Asia, right here, this is French. Remember, the French had established themselves in Saigon. So even before and then here's, of course, the great empire of China right here, which was still independent. So you got the French here, you got the French in Southeast Asia, the British already established in India, you got Russia to the north, over here is Japan, and these are all these powers. What we see is all these great powers kind of competing with one another for control and territory, and mainly in China. So that kind of gives you a layout of the land at this particular time. All right. Now it's important to remember that in this race for empire, Great Britain didn't really have any alliances with France or Russia. It wasn't like when they made their agreement with France and Russia, it wasn't like it was made out of a sense of friendship and common culture or common values. It was an alliance based on a common fear. Because if you look at the whole history of imperialism in Asia, Great Britain had as much competition with France and with Russia as it did with Germany. But Germany came to be seen as the greater threat in the region. Just to give you a couple examples. In one area where Russia and Great Britain clashed was Afghanistan. You see, the Russians were expanding beginning in the middle of the 19th century. Russian forces began to expand deep into Central Asia. So all those stands, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, all these areas in Central Asia, these areas were basically absorbed by the growing Russian Empire during the 19th century. The Russian used Cossacks to come in and the Russian equivalent of cowboys to use them as forces to occupy and defeat the different Turkish and Mongol tribes that lived in these areas. So the Russians were expanding eastward into Central Asia, and the British controlled India, and that included what is today the land of Pakistan. So Afghanistan was an area in which the two empires came into contact with each other and were both competing for influence. Now, what happened though was that southern Afghanistan and northern and eastern Pakistan actually are one unit. It's called, there are people called Pashtuns. They've lived there since about the 6th century AD. They're Indo-European people. And the Pashtuns, they lived in the mountain. They were mountain people. They lived in the mountains in what is today Pakistan and Afghanistan, and they were a united people, you see. But the Pashtuns were very warlike. I mean, they had been, for centuries, they had been recruited by Muslim jihadists to wage war against Hindus. And they were always, they saw the Brits as infidels, and so the Pashtuns were always making incursions against the British. So in 1874, 1877, the British decided to basically make a war to kind of drive back the Pashtuns. And it was a very bloody war. And they never did conquer Afghanistan, but what they decided to do was to use the mountains to create a border. And so basically, they created this artificial border that went right down the middle of the land of the Pashtuns. So on one side of it was British India, which is today Pakistan, and the other side was independent Afghanistan. They just didn't care about the rest of it, as long as they had that border to keep the peace. And that border still exists to this day, even though it was artificially created by the British over 100 years ago. And that's why you have Pashtuns who are all Taliban, who some are fighting against Pakistan and some are fighting against the government of Afghanistan, and they're all fighting wars against the United States of America, because we're the evil infidels. We've replaced the British as the infidels that must be crushed and defeated. But anyway, so these events that happened over 100 years ago still influence what's going on in the world today. So, but see, the Russians were also interested in conquering Afghanistan and expanding their reach and their territory. And in 1885, as Russian forces advanced into Afghanistan, they almost went to battle against British forces defending that border in the mountains that separated British India from Afghanistan. And so there was called the Great Diplomatic Crisis of 1885. You know, we already talked about how the French and the British almost went to war over the Sudan in Fashoda in 1898, in the middle of the desert in Sudan. Well, in the middle of the mountains, in the middle of nowhere in Central Asia, Russia and Great Britain almost came to blows in the diplomatic crisis of 1885. Now, another area of contention was Southeast Asia. The French, in 1885, they decided to expand their holdings they already controlled Saigon, and they decided to take over the rest of Vietnam. So Tonkin, which is today North Vietnam, was occupied by French forces in 1885. Now the British, not to be outdone, the British expanded northeast out of India and conquered Burma. Burma was a land, now it's the nation of Myanmar. Burma was a land made up of a bunch of tribes and ethnic groups in the jungles of Southeast Asia. And see, Burma is an artificial creation. It was created by the British when they conquered all these tribes and brought them under British rule. But it was the conquest into Burma was an effort to try to counter French expansion in Southeast Asia. So the French were trying to establish complete control of what became known as French Indochina, Southeast Asia. And the British saw Burma as a way of trying to counter British influence. Now, interesting enough, you ever heard, Thailand? It used to be called Siam, like Siamese twins, Siam. And Siam, the king of Siam, was able to maintain independence from both the British and the French by playing the sides against each other. Ever seen The King and I, the musical, or heard that musical? It's based on a true story of a British governess who was sent to provide education for the king of Siam, Yul Brynner's. Yul Brynner. The king of Siam, he's the actor in the movie version of the musical. But that's what the king of Siam was very smart. He knew if he could play one side against another, he could, by playing one empire against another, he could maintain his independence. And Siam was the one nation in Southeast Asia that was not occupied by either the French or the British. But both Burma and Vietnam and Cambodia were occupied by the French in one place and the British in the other. But the biggest prize, though, the biggest prize in Asia was China, of course. And it so happened that China, in the late 19th century, was very weak. It was going through, we've discussed this already, the dynastic cycle. The Manchu or Qin dynasty, the last great dynasty, the Manchu dynasty, was on its last legs. Remember, in the dynastic cycle, toward the end of the dynasty, you have weak rulers, and that created a situation where at the local level, military guys, military generals, kind of became more and more independent, and the country's centralized government collapsed and became weaker. Well, we see that in operation in the late 19th century. Now, and also another symptom of the dynastic cycle is when there are challenges to the government, when religious groups claim to be legitimate rulers and challenge the powers that be because they believe that the powers that be has lost, what do we call it, the mandate of heaven. And that we see that happening in this particular time period. By the defeat in the Opium War was a big blow. Remember, the Chinese believed that they were the only people that mattered. That everybody else was just barbarians. You had Chinese, and then everybody else were barbarians. We're just primitive savages. So the only people on earth that mattered were the Chinese. So if a Chinese people were defeated by barbarians, that was a sign that the gods above, the powers that be in the universe, were against the reigning dynasty. So losing to Great Britain in the Opium War was a big blow to the respect for the Manchu dynasty. And you got to remember that there were some questions about the Manchu dynasty in a lot of Chinese's minds anyway, because their origins were foreign. Remember, they were Manchus from the north who had conquered China back in the 17th century. So there was that element as well. Well, for example, in 1850, from 1850 to 1864, there was a massive rebellion that challenged the Manchu dynasty. It's called the Taiping Rebellion. And it was started by a peasant by the name of Hong Hihuan. Hong Hihuan, what he did is he had heard about Christian missionaries. Christian missionaries were kind of to make an impact in China. And for some reason, he decided that he was Jesus' brother. So he was like Jesus' brother, and he was the Son of God, and he was divine. And he mixed Christianity with a combination of Buddhism and Taoism and other religions. He kind of created his own religion. And he was very charismatic, and he was able to convince thousands upon thousands that he was the true emperor of China, and that he was a god, and he should establish himself as the ruler of China. And thousands upon thousands of Chinese, especially in South China, believed in him. And these people created their own army to challenge the Manchu dynasty. And it was only after a lot of blood had been shed. It's estimated that probably millions of people died. Not all from, it wasn't just being killed, but what happened by war. But what happened during the course of this war, of course, was there was, it interrupted the agricultural cycle and the agricultural work. So there were deficiencies of food and famines, and that probably killed millions of people at this time. It was a terrible war. But eventually, Taiping Rebellion was crushed by the Manchu dynasty. But then on top of that, the next thing that happened to Manchu dynasty was it was ruled by a terrible ruler. One of the worst rulers in Chinese history, Zhu Xi. Now Zhu Xi, here's her picture when she was an older lady. She was actually a peasant woman. And she was, well, I guess when she was young, you can't really see it in this picture, I guess when she was young, and she was very, very beautiful and very vivacious. And the reigning Manchu dynasty loved her. He picked her out, made her his wife, and since she was the favorite wife, that meant that her children would be the next rulers of China. So she became the Dowager Empress. Well, what happened was that the emperor died, and since his children were only just kids at the time, she took upon herself to be the ruler of China. And she's known as the Dowager Empress. Now what happened, though, was that she continued to be Dowager Empress even when the kids grew up. So she continued to hold on to power for years. Now she was a very capable woman and very intelligent and brilliant and was able to rule China, but the thing about her is she didn't give a flick about actually governing China. All she cared about was building pleasure palaces and pleasure boats and rewarding her friends with gifts. So she really loved being in power, and she was good on holding on to power. She just wasn't very good at governing. So the result was that China, she wasted a lot of money. A lot of eunuchs, that she favorite eunuchs, lived like kings, and she wasted a lot of money, and she let the military kind of go to pot. And at the local level, generals began to seize control. And so, as a result of her weak government, China kind of collapsed and became a much weaker state and decentralized. And this collapse of China's central government, what that did was create a vacuum, and that's what invited European powers to really see an opportunity for themselves to kind of grab up Chinese property for themselves, to carve out spheres of influence in China, where their country would have a dominant control over different parts of China. Now, believe it or not, the one nation, it wasn't a European nation that started this aggression against China. It wasn't European, it was Japan. It was Japan that began the process of trying to carve out territories out of China. But by the time that Japan started to do that, Japan had made fundamental changes in its government, its society, its culture. And it's related to what is called the Meiji Restoration. You're going to read about that in your documents of world history. You see, the Tokugawa shogunate, that regime that had been set up in 1600, that continued all the way into the mid-19th century. And Japan continued to keep its borders closed and its ports closed and not allow hardly any outside contact. But that ended thanks to American intervention. In 1855, Commodore Matthew Perry, you can see his picture here, he was the commander of the American Navy, Americans. See, at this time, the Americans believed in this idea of manifest destiny. And Americans wanted to open up, they saw the Pacific as an American ocean in the 19th century. And it was at this time that Americans were colonizing Hawaii, and many Americans saw opportunities for the America to expand in the Pacific, and Matthew Perry was such an individual. So in 1855, American ships forced their way into a Japanese harbor, into other Japanese harbors, and they forcibly forced Japan to open up their ports to foreign traffic. Now, many Japanese intellectuals and Japanese government officials, when they saw this happening and they looked over what was going on in China, they said, we can't allow that to happen here. We can't just be a victim here. We can't allow these Europeans to come in and just dominate us. We need to make fundamental changes in our system of government, in our economics, in our politics, in our society, so that we don't get dominated by these European and the Americans. We need to stand up to them. So what the Japanese leaders began to believe was that they needed to westernize. They would call it modernization or westernization. They were going to borrow from the West, from America and Europe, and adopt aspects of their culture to make their own country stronger, and so that they could compete and not be pushed around by Americans and Europeans. And so the first step was to get rid of the Tokugawa shogunate, which was seen as regressive and backward. So a group of samurai who wanted to westernize Japan, they had a coup. In 1868, the last of the shoguns was forced out, and it was called the Meiji Restoration because the Japanese emperor was, quote-unquote, restored to full power. Now, they didn't really restore, remember, the Japanese emperor had been around forever as a figurehead. And basically what these reforming officials did was to say, we're doing this because we're trying to restore the power of the emperor. We're not radicals. We're not trying to invent a new Japan. We're basically going back to the old. So they were still set upon major reforms in Japanese society, but they were doing it in the name of tradition. So they were basically trying to have the best of two worlds. They were being traditionalist in their view because they were restoring the power of the emperor. But the Emperor Meiji remained still a figurehead. It was the people really running Japan were these groups of reforming samurai who had seized power and were running the government. Now, once they were in control, and once they had seized control of the government in the name of the Emperor Meiji and restored the emperor, these officials decided, okay, we need to find out, we're going to send out officials to Japan, to America, to Europe, and they decided, they went to Germany, they went to Britain, they went to the United States, and they decided, let's find out what these countries do, what they do best, and then copy them, right? So one of the things they discovered, so they basically went through and they liked the American system of education, of technical colleges. So they said, let's adopt that model. So they established, they created all these new colleges to train people in engineering and accounting and in Western education. They also reformed the bureaucracy. They liked the German civil service, the system of having civil service examinations and having a system of bureaucrats. They liked the German system of civil service, so they adopted that wholesale and redid their whole bureaucracy, modeling it after the German civil service. They liked the American and German economy. Remember in Great Britain, remember in Germany and the United States you had these giant cartels, and they decided that would, if they really wanted to modernize their economy and adopt the latest technology and build factories and railroads, that was the model to go for. And in Japan, a cartel, a company that dominates a field, and whether it be coal mining or steel production or whatever, is called a zaibatsu. So all these new companies. A lot of the great companies in Japan today, like Toyota and all these these auto companies, they started out as earlier companies in other fields as zaibatsu during the Meiji Restoration. And from Japan, from the day one, maybe you've heard the phrase Japanese Inc. Japanese is a big corporation. Japan is a big corporation. Well, it goes back to the days of the Meiji Restoration, because from day one it was decided that the private sector, that merchants would work with the government to create these giant companies, because they felt that these companies that were giant and dominated the field would be the best companies. They could invest in the latest technologies and grow rapidly and expand quickly. So Japan very rapidly industrialized, building factories, building railroads, building telegraph lines, and they did it in a very short period of time because they were basically just borrowing wholesale from the Germans and from the Americans, and just using the government and creating these huge cartels or zaibatsu to implement this industrialization on a rapid scale. Now all these changes, though, were not all welcomed by all Japanese. A lot of samurai were very traditional, and there was a big rebellion, in fact, by traditional-minded samurai in 1877, the Satsuma Rebellion. But by this time, the Japanese government had reformed its military and created a modern standard army, and this modern standard army, trained in the latest German methods of fighting, was able to make short work of the samurai army and crush this rebellion in 1877. Now, eventually, Japan decided that if they were going to be like Western nations and the United States, they needed to have a written constitution. So they created a constitution. And you got to remember that the Japanese government was dominated by these former samurai, right? These families of samurai that had military origins. And these samurai looked around and they said, you know what, if we want to adopt a constitution that's Western, but best suits our national history and our tradition, that Bismarck Constitution works for us. Because remember, the Bismarck Constitution was designed to retain the autonomy of the military. And a lot of Japanese could kind of sympathize with Junkers in the Prussian system. So they created, under the Constitution of 1889, you had a legislature and you had a system of government, but the military was independent. The military answered only to the emperor, which means they answered to nobody because the emperor was just a figurehead. So under this Constitution, the military ran itself. It could do whatever it wanted. And under this Constitution, they also decided to establish a very high property qualification. So only people of pretty good means could actually vote. So they did adopt a Western model, a liberal constitution with a legislature and they had a prime minister and the whole 9 yards. But it was also a system that retained the domination by the military, by the old samurai families. They continued to dominate because the military was huge and retained its independence from the legislature, the elected legislature. Now, it would be Japan that decided that they needed to expand, that they bought into the whole age of imperialism idea. Social Darwinism, expansion, need for raw materials, and Japan really wanted to create Greater Japan. So it would be Japan that would begin to really take advantage of a weakened China. And Japan actually went to war against China, called the Sino-Japanese War, 1894-1895, and basically they established a protectorate over Korea. And eventually the last Korean emperor was forced off the throne, and the Japanese began to incorporate Korea into their empire. You know, by the middle of the 19th century, basically, it was against the law to speak Korean in Korea. They wanted to Japanese, I don't know how you say it in a verb. They wanted to Japanese the population. They wanted to make Koreans Japanese. So all instruction in the schools was in Japanese. The Korean language was abolished. I mean, they brought in all these Japanese colonists to try to take over the area. But they wanted to turn Korea into Greater Japan. They also took over the island of Formosa and occupied that island as well as part of this war. Now, what the Japanese started, once the Japanese started this process of dismembering China, all the other great powers were thinking, well, if Japan gets into it, we got to get into it too. So in 1898, Russia occupied, they called it Port Arthur. It was the Russians were expanding across Siberia. They were building a Trans-Siberian Railway, and they wanted a warm water port in the Pacific. The Russians were trying to dominate the Pacific, just like the Americans were. And so they established a port. This was in North China, and they named it Port Arthur. So they seized Chinese territory and made it their own. Not to be outdone, the Germans decided they needed to show how great their fleet was. And in 1898, German forces occupied the port of Xiaoqiao. I don't know how to say it, but I think that's my best approximation. What had happened is some German missionaries had been killed, and so the Germans said, oh, well, we need to intervene to protect Christians in China. So they sent this, that was just a pretext, of course, they sent their navy and they occupied this port and claimed it as their own. So now you got the Japanese, you got the Russians, you got the Germans, the French were thinking, hey, we got to have our sphere of influence too. They were trying to claim that South China was their territory. So all these great powers were all trying to claim that different parts of China belonged to them. Nobody was asking the Chinese what they wanted, of course. Now, but then the United States got involved, believe it or not. You see, in 1898, the United States and Spain went to war. The United States claimed the war was about liberating Cuba from Spanish rule. America had always had its eyes on expanding into Cuba. It's only 70 miles from Florida. But when the war was over, we did not take over Cuba because that would make us look really bad, because we claimed that the war was to liberate Cuba, so to take over Cuba would have been really bad, right? So Cuba was left independent, but as a result of this war, the United States conquered all this territory that had once belonged to Spain. So the Spanish Empire was stripped, and former Spanish possessions now became American possessions. So Americans acquired the Philippine Islands. So all the Philippines now became a Spanish colony. Now that the Americans were in the Philippines, though, they found themselves in a war to try to crush Filipino independence people, and that's where the concentration camps came in. That's where the United States, according to some estimates, the war that the United States fought in the Philippines cost the lives of some 2 million Filipinos. Not because of Americans shooting them, but because the war would displace populations and cause famines, and a lot of people died as a result. But 5,000 Americans lost their lives too. But eventually America established itself over control over the Philippines. The Philippines is a classic example of where the United States spent a lot of money to conquer the Philippines, but they ended up, I think they felt guilty, because they ended up spending more money building hospitals and schools and all this other infrastructure, and so it ended up costing them more money than what they gained from it. Kind of like Iraq, Afghanistan. We have a history of doing that. We got to go take over this country. It's a matter of national security. And then, oh boy, this is really expensive. What the hell are we doing? But anyway, we controlled the Philippines. Philippines won its independence. We granted them their independence after World War II. So through the end of World War II, we were the colonial power in the Philippines. But you see, the United States and Great Britain, they had vested interest in expanding in China, and they talked about the open door. Their approach was, instead of everybody trying to carve out territories for themselves in China, all the European powers and the United States and Japan ought to allow free trade, allow free competition in China. Now, you got to remember that all this was going on, but the Chinese people were not too happy with all this. The way they saw it was that all these foreigners were coming into their country and acting like they were better than they were. Now, the Chinese had a history of believing that they were the chosen ones. Yes?
Who was it who was a proponent of the open door?
The United States and Great Britain.
Okay.
The United States and Great Britain were allies in all this, but the other powers were advocating carving out China into spheres of influence. Now, what happened was that in China, though, there was a movement, a religious movement, and it was called the Boxer Rebellion. But the Boxers, that was the name given them by Europeans and Americans. They actually were a secret society. They were called the Society of Righteous Fists, because they believed that they would, how in Buddhism and Taoism you learn martial arts. They could believe that by training in martial arts, they would kick back on the Europeans. They were going to fight this war, and they believed that the gods were on their side. And they were convinced that Christians were the enemy, because all these missionaries were coming in and trying to convert the Chinese people to Christianity. So they wanted to kill all the white devils and crush the Christians. So in 1898, the Boxers went on a rampage. They started slaughtering Christians, and Chinese Christians too, and burning down European homes and attacking Europeans. And it turned out that the Dowager Empress, who was getting a little tired of being pushed around by European powers, she was actually secretly supporting the Boxers. Well, anyway, in 1900, the Boxers in Beijing, or what is today Peking, the capital, they took over the foreign embassies in Beijing. So all the European powers and the United States sent in the forces to liberate their embassies. And the United States sent in the Marines to liberate the American embassy in Beijing. And when it was all said and done, it was discovered that the Dowager Empress had played a role in encouraging the Boxers. So after the Boxer Rebellion was crushed by European and American intervention, it was decided that China had to pay this huge indemnity, this huge penalty to all the European and Americans. And the Russians what the Russians did was to force the Chinese government to hand over control of Manchuria to Russia, to allow the Russians to build a railway to link the Trans-Siberian Railway to the Pacific. So the Russians got out of it concessions to build a railway and to establish a protectorate in Manchuria. So it looked really hard for the Chinese government. Now, given this situation, what happened is that after this period was that all the great powers were kind of figuring out where everything stood. And what all the great powers decided was that all the powers in China, the biggest threat were the Russians and the Germans. They were seen as had the greatest potential for kind of expanding their holdings in China. So what happened was, first of all, the Japanese, they were thinking, okay, we got the Russians, we got the Germans. The British are the least offensive to us, so let's make an alliance with them. So Japan and Great Britain. Now you got to remember that wherever Great Britain went, the United States followed. So America wasn't a party to this, but America was kind of open to what the British were doing. So in 1902, the British and the Japanese made an alliance. Now this alliance was targeting Germany and Russia. Now the British decided, given all this, given the vast expansion of Germany, their efforts to create an empire in Asia and create an empire in Africa, given all this, the British decided that their best bet in all this was to make an alliance with France and with Russia. Now, they signed an agreement with France in 1904, which established a military alliance between France and Great Britain. And then, 3 years later, they signed an agreement with Russia. They kind of decided to get together with Russia and put aside all their previous disagreements. And they reached a series of agreements which would later prove embarrassing to the British and the Russians. For example, they agreed, and this would really make our future Iranians really mad, they agreed that at a later date they would partition Iran between themselves. The Russians would take the north, the British would take the south. They never did that, but these were the plans. They also planned on partitioning Afghanistan between the two powers. Russia would take part, the British would take the other part, and they also agreed that the Russians would occupy Tibet, that this part of China would become Greater Russia. So basically the British and the Russians, to set aside their differences, they decided that all these parts of Asia would be partitioned between their powers. Did they ask these people what they wanted? No. The agreement was, we're going to take over these territories. So the Anglo-Russian Entente in 1907 set aside Russian and British differences. So now you had Great Britain, France, and Russia that had set aside their past differences, had made agreements with one another, and they all were designed to counter the growing power of Germany. So that's what's all going on here. And the next step is to talk about the events that led to the outbreak of war, so now that the alliance systems were in place. So why don't we take a little break? We've gone a while. I take a little bit of a break, and then we'll talk about the outbreak of World War I. Okay, one thing you got to remember. We talked about at the very beginning, we talked about how you had a lot of tension going on. You had social tension, you had ethnic tension, and how nationalism was a way to try to keep those tensions from making countries fly apart. So nationalism was the glue to hold countries together when social class tensions threatened to break countries apart. So when social and class tensions got aggravated and became greater, as a result, nationalism would get more, to counteract it, stronger. Exactly. So what we see at the beginning of the 20th century, the Western world was, social revolution was on everybody's lips. I mean, the world was very tense. There was, in 1914, on the eve of World War I, or 1912 it was, there was a Senate committee that talked about how if something wasn't done to help the working class, then the United States would face a social revolution. So something had to be done to help the working people, or there was going to be violent confrontation. I mean, and there were in the United States history, there was a wave of violent strikes right here in the United States. The Lawrence strike in Lawrence, Massachusetts, textile workers went on a rampage. The International Workers of the World, the IWW, radical union, created to foment class warfare, was behind the Lawrence strike. There was a terrible strike in Nevada, a silver mine there, Alene mine, where hundreds of workers were shot by militiamen, by by the national state troopers. I mean, it was just a bloodbath. So even in the United States, which is a country that doesn't have an aristocratic class, doesn't have a class system quite as pronounced as Europe, there was talk about social revolution. And in the case of Russia, there was a revolution in 1905. And there was a wave of revolutionary threats that swept across Europe in the beginning of the 20th century. So let's talk about the Russian Revolution that really got things rolling. This is the Russian Revolution that was the revolution before the revolution. Now, in 1905, Russia was ruled by its last Tsar, Nicholas II, and he wasn't a bad man by any means. He was a man of integrity, except that he was very conservative and believed in the divine right of kings, and believed that he answered to nobody but God. And he was very conservative, so he wasn't open at all to any kind of reform or liberalism or anything like that. So he was hell-bent on any type of structural change to Russia. But at the time, you had in Russia a growing middle class that wanted some kind of liberal reform in Russia, and you also had a very, very chaotic situation in the countryside, because you had all these former serfs who were peasants who had to face heavy taxes and had to serve a required term in the military, and there was a big demand for land reform out in the countryside, because you had so many peasants in Russia who were hardly make ends meet because of the heavy taxation burden and all the other requirements, but were barely making it. So you had a very difficult situation in Russia. And on top of that, what eventually caused the situation in Russia to break was the Russo-Japanese War. In 1904, Japan and Russia went to war against each other. Remember, the Russians had occupied Manchuria, made it into a protectorate. Russia had designs on expanding in Korea, and the Japanese believed that Korea belonged to them. So in 1904, the Japanese did something. This is important in future history. The Japanese decided that if they could destroy the Russian fleet at Port Arthur, then they could win the war, because once they destroyed the Russian fleet, it would be hard for the Russians to get men and supplies all the way from European Russia all the way to East Asia. So in 1904, they launched a surprise attack. I think the United States would figure this out in 1941. In 1904, they launched a surprise attack on Port Arthur and destroyed the Russian fleet. And that put the Russians at a disadvantage, because they didn't have a replacement fleet. And that meant that they had to load all of their supplies and their troops, put them on trains, and send them across Siberia to get to the front. The Japanese had much shorter line of supply lanes. Most of the war was fought in Manchuria and in Korea, and Japan had much shorter supply lines, so they could more quickly put money, men, and supplies into action. And when it was all said and done, the Russians were defeated. It looked like the Russians were going to get even worse beaten, but the United States and Great Britain intervened. They didn't want to see the Japan get too big-headed. So the United States, led by President Theodore Roosevelt, and Great Britain encouraged this, called for negotiations to end the war. And the two sides met actually in New Hampshire, in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and that's where the peace treaty between Japan and Russia was signed. And basically, it was a humiliating treaty for Russia, because they basically gave up Port Arthur. That was handed over to Japan. They gave up Manchuria. Now the Japanese were given the control over the railway that the Russians had begun to build. So it was a big blow to Russia. Now, Russia could have gotten hurt even more, but the United States intervened because they didn't want to see Japan get too strong. They wanted to maintain a balance of power in East Asia. And the Japanese remembered that too. They said, you know what? We could have gone all the way, but those Americans and Brits, they got no way. You can't trust those Americans. Now that would jump ahead 40 years and see what happens. Now, so now the Japanese, the war between Japan and Russia was a big blow to the Russian government. And the war had created all kinds of shortfalls, you know, food shortages and all that, because so much of the country's resources were going into the war. So there were a bunch of shortages of food, and food prices went up. And so what happened was in 1905, in St. Petersburg, there were riots in the streets. There were riots in the countryside. The whole country was looking like it was going to collapse into a social revolution. And Nicholas II was scared to death. So he did what other kings and emperors had done during revolutions past. He said, we're going to write a constitution. So he called for universal male suffrage, because basically that's what the revolutionaries wanted. And he called for an election to a Duma, which is the Russian word for an assembly, to write a new constitution for Russia. And so this call for a Duma in 1905, that kind of stopped the revolution, because many people thought that this was a sign that things were going to get better. That things were going to get better, and that Russia was headed toward reform. So the Duma was called, and that kind of temporarily put a ceasefire on the social revolution. Now, when the elections were held in 1905 to elect the Duma, the socialists in Russia had already split. The old Russian Social Democratic Labor Party had split into two factions. Mensheviks were socialists, but they believed that socialists needed to work with liberals to create a democratic Russia, and that socialism could be achieved through legislation. So they wanted to see socialism, but done just like the Germans and the British socialists, done incrementally. So they were willing to work with liberals to create a democratic Russia. Lenin, here's his picture here. Lenin, who was the leader of the Bolshevik Party, they didn't believe in that. They thought that was a bunch of Bolshevik. They believed that the only way to achieve socialism was through violent revolution. That the middle class could only be crushed. They had to be exterminated. They had to be crushed. The only way to achieve a socialist utopian system of true socialism was through the dictatorship of the proletariat. You needed to have a strong, united party, a single political party with dictatorial power to just implement a thorough, radical changeover, makeover of all of society to create true socialism. And he believed that was the key. So he was a big advocate of violent revolution. He believed we're not going to achieve anything incrementally. If you want to have a revolution, you got to kill a lot of people. You got to just exterminate whole ways of thinking. That's the only way to get things done. Violent revolution. That's the way to do it. Lenin, when he was a young socialist, Lenin heard about this guy named Mussolini in Italy. He said, that Mussolini, he's the future of Italy. Because Mussolini used to be a socialist before he became a fascist. Well, fascists are socialists. But anyway, so Lenin was like, we have a violent revolution. So that he said, Bolsheviks, we're not going to participate in any election. We refuse. These elections are a sham. Mensheviks, on the other hand, they participated. They ran for office. So when they had the first Duma met in 1905, it was dominated by socialists. The Mensheviks got a lot of the seats. Now there was the other major party was a party called, I don't know what its Russian name was, but it translated as Social Revolutionaries. Now the Social Revolutionaries were not socialists, so they were basically land reformers. They believed in democracy and liberalism, but basically what they wanted to do was redistribute land. They wanted to break up the big estates and distribute land to the peasants, so every peasant would get his own little farmland to get a fresh start. That was their vision. And the Social Revolutionaries, they actually got more seats in the Duma than the Mensheviks, but those were the two biggest parties. Now, by the time the first Duma got together, the revolution was a memory, and Nicholas II looked out and saw all these social revolutionaries and Mensheviks and said, what have I done? Go home. I don't want you here. The revolution was over. Things had calmed down, so he figured he could just let the first Duma go. So he called for a new election, and a new Duma, thinking if he had another election, maybe he wouldn't get as many Mensheviks and social revolutionaries elected. And they had the second Duma, and they convened in 1907, and Nicholas II looked out and he saw a lot of Mensheviks and social revolutionaries. So he said, aha, this time we're going to change, we're going to scrap universal male suffrage and say only people with lots of property can vote. So they had a new election. They elected a third Duma, and the third Duma was dominated by wealthy middle-class people because, of course, they were the only ones who could vote. And the third Duma was willing to work with the Tsar. So he allowed the third Duma to exist. But they wrote a constitution that gave the Duma no power. Under the constitution that they wrote, all the Duma could do was advise the Tsar, but they couldn't enact any legislation. So basically that was something that Nicholas II could live with. But, you see, the third Duma, even though it didn't have any real power, it created this idea that reform and liberal policies and democracy were on their way, that it was just a matter of time before Russia would change. And so there was this sense among many Russian reformers and liberals that this was the beginning, that they had a foot in the door, that Russia was poised for greater things. So that you had to have that mood. And what united many members of Russia was this growing nationalism, this love of their Slavic heritage and their Orthodox Church. And so this nationalism, there was a lot of hope, there was a lot of nationalism, there was this sense that reform was just around the corner. And so you got to remember that was going on in Russia at this time. And so there was, anytime you have a lot of expectations, when those expectations are dashed, people get really upset. So the rising hopes of Russia going into World War I were a factor that would lead eventually to the major Russian Revolution of 1917, 1918. Now, what happened in Russia though in 1905? It had like a boomerang effect. I mean, it kind of not a boomerang effect. What do you call those things? What? Domino, I guess that'd be a good word. But you see, there were calls for social revolution in other parts of Europe as well. But you see, in other parts of Europe, the powers that be decided that, just like the United States had decided, that if you make reforms, maybe the working class won't embrace social revolution. Maybe if you create reforms that help out working people, maybe they won't be open to a radical, violent revolution that can be very destructive. So what we see happening in Europe is that some very important legislation was passed across Europe with the idea of helping the lower classes and giving them a leg up. For example, Great Britain in 1911 passed, the Labour Party and the Liberal Party together passed the National Insurance Bill. Now, the National Insurance Bill is actually the model for the Social Security system that we have in this country. It created a system of pensions for the elderly, created a system of pensions for those unable to work due to disease or illness or injury. So it was kind of like the Social Security Act of Great Britain in 1911. France did something else. France decided to basically lift taxes on the poor. They created what is called a graduated income tax, where the more money you make, the higher percentage you pay back in taxes. So instead of having a set tax that everybody pays, wealthier people pay more than less wealthy people. So it lifts the burden of taxation from the lower classes and places the burden of taxation on the wealthy. And that was seen as a way of saying, look, we care about you working class people. We're not going to make you shoulder the burden of the government. We're going to lessen your burden and make those who are wealthier pay for it. So these were ways in which governments in Europe knew that social revolution was a real possibility, and the best way to deal with that was through social reform. Same thing happened in the United States. Many historians would say that the progressive era in the United States, which was going on at this time, was an effort by the elites to try to alleviate the conditions of the poor. So we see happening in the United States the creation of workman compensation laws. We see the passage of children's labor laws to prevent children from working. We see the passage of laws that provided a minimum wage for women and children. So a lot of these laws were passed, according to some historians in America, because there was this kind of fear that unless reforms were made to help working people, then you might have a revolution that would be very destructive on one's hands. So you had a situation in going on around in the Western world where things were very tense, and it was at this time when times were very tense. Oh, one thing I should mention also. This is important to remember. In 1906, when in Germany, when there were calls for revolution, the German Social Democratic Party, the Socialist Party of Germany, said, no, we can't have a revolution. Nationalism is more important than revolution. We need to support our government. We need to support Germany. That's what's our number one priority ought to be. So the more conservative Socialist Party in Germany was saying, look, nationalism is what matters. We need to be loyal to our country and advance our nation's interests. That takes priority over any kind of social revolution. All right. So you had a lot of tension going on, and what was keeping these countries together was this really strong nationalism. So what we see happening is that when you have strong nationalism in play, when you have certain incidents that happen around the world, even minor incidents, it creates a lot of tension and the threat of war. And I'm just giving you a couple examples. Like in 1905, you know where Morocco is? It's in North Africa. Well, Morocco's government was in trouble. They owed a lot of money. And there was a fear in 1905 that the French were going to go in there and take over Morocco so that the king of Morocco would honor his foreign debts. And also, the Spanish government also had a vested interest in Morocco. So the situation was very fluid. Well, anyway, Kaiser William II decided, for reasons that we don't really clear, to send in the German Navy. And the German Navy arrived in Morocco and said, "We're here to protect the integrity of Morocco. We Germans are the friends of all Muslims. We love the Muslims." You know, for whatever reason, he wanted to be Mr. Muslim. So anyway, so he goes in there and sends in the fleet, and this created a huge ruckus because, like, the Britain and France were thinking, what's Germany doing sending their fleet to Morocco? And so, I mean, there was all this talk about war over Morocco. So Theodore Roosevelt, the President of the United States, decided, okay, he didn't want to see a war break out. He was a man, he won the Nobel Peace Prize for this. Theodore Roosevelt said, let's have a big peace conference and resolve these differences. We don't need to go to war over Morocco. So they had a big conference in Spain at Algeciras, and what they decided to do in the European fashion was, without asking the Moroccan people, they decided that Morocco would be divided between Spain and France. You know, so that's how they divided. That's, you know, but Theodore Roosevelt, that's what, you know, he loved peace, but the only people he liked were Europeans, you know, like himself. If you weren't a European, you were just, you know, you were a sub-race, you know, whatever. Now, so then the next major area of international crisis was the Balkans, and what precipitated the whole problem in the Balkans was the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and social revolution or political revolution in the Ottoman Empire. It says when the Ottoman Empire began to collapse, all these European powers were like vultures looking for a way to pick clean the bones and to get their advantage. So that created a problem. Now the last powerful sultan of the Ottoman Empire, there's this picture up there, was Abdul Hamid II. And he was kind of like Tsar Nicholas II. He was a conservative sultan. He believed that his power came from Allah. And he didn't like democracy or anything. So now there was, in Turkey though, there were a lot of Turkish young people who were the children of military officers and children of Turkish officials. And these young Turks would go to school in Europe, they'd go to Paris, they'd go to London, and they would come back to Turkey and they'd say, we need to reform, we need to modernize Turkey, we need to make Turkey more like a European country, we need a constitution, we need a liberal constitution, we need to westernize and modernize our government. And these young Turks, as they were called, since they were the children of influential Turks, they often, when they were young men, they became military officers and bureaucratic officials and held high positions. And these young Turks were determined to reform the empire. Well, what happened though was that what gave them their shot to seize power was the fact that the government of Abdul Hamid II became increasingly isolated from support around the world. And between 1895 and 1898, there were a series of rebellions that were motivated by nationalism. You had revolts in Armenia, Macedonia, and on the island of Crete. And I gotta get out of here. But the government of Abdul Hamid II crushed these uprisings after lots of violent deaths. In Armenia and in Crete and in Macedonia, a lot of people died. And the brutality of the Turkish troops alienated the rest of the world from the government of Abdul Hamid II. So that's what gave the young Turks an opportunity to exercise their power, and they would do so in the Turkish Revolution of 1908. So what we're going to do next time is talk about how the situation in the Balkans spun out of control would lead to the outbreak of World War I, and we'll talk about World War I and its aftermath on Thursday.